Welcome to Immigration Nation, a podcast that dives deep into the complex and often misunderstood world of United States immigration through interviews with leading U.S. immigration attorneys. This podcast aims to provide a comprehensive overview of the policies, struggles, and victories within the ever-changing world of immigration. Each episode will offer fresh perspectives and valuable insight using real-life stories to navigate our nation's immigration system. If you have an immigration question or an existing case, join us here on Immigration Nation, because this podcast was made for you.
Hi everyone, my name is Klein and I'm joined today by Mr. Gary Davis. Today we're going to be going over some frequently asked questions about the F1 student visa. So let's jump into it. The F1 student visa may sound like a simple process, but there are definitely some important factors that go into it to make sure that your petition isn't denied. Is that correct?
It is. So a student visa is basically a temporary visa, or what we call in the business a non-immigrant visa, as opposed to immigrant, which would be somebody that wanted to stay on a permanent basis. So you're telling the government by coming on an F1 student visa that you're planning to come here, get your education, and then leave at the end of your stay. Whereas the immigrant process or the green card process is a different intention, right? It's the intention to stay on a permanent basis and live here, make a life here, raise a family here, work here, those kinds of things. So those are a little bit different from each other, but there are certainly paths that lead from the student visa into permanent residence if that's a goal for someone who's come here as a student.
So it may be a bit more challenging than the average adjustment of status, correct? If somebody were to go on that path from the student visa to something else in United States immigration. So what are those sorts of different pathways?
There's lots of different ways you can do it, but it's going to vary individual to individual what those options might be. For example, the most common path would be to change over to a work authorized visa, for example, an H-1B work visa, and then move from that through an employment sponsorship situation into permanent residence. That's referred to as an EB-2 or an EB-3 type visa, depending on the education level and the experience. So that's one. Obviously, there are family options. For example, people come here on a student visa and they meet someone, they fall in love, they decide to get married. And so there is a path through marriage, whether it's through marriage to a permanent resident or a U.S. citizen. That could lead to like a family option for becoming a permanent resident here. If someone comes and perhaps they're doing a PhD, for example, and they have established themselves as outstanding in their field, there is an O1 outstanding or extraordinary ability visa for someone who's kind of reached that high level.
Oh, wow.
And has some international recognition, and then you can pivot that into an extraordinary ability green card as well, which is called an EB-1A. Or for PhDs, academics that are doing research at a high level, or are outstanding teachers in the country, there's an EB-1B. So those kind of extraordinary ability paths are available. If someone has come here with a very high net worth, they have a lot of cash, they wanted to come do a master's degree, for example, but they're independently wealthy and they have, say, $1 million cash that they could invest in the U.S., there is an EB-5 green card that's a pathway to permanent residence as an investor into a company or into an investment bank called a regional center here in the U.S. to create jobs and stimulate the economy with that cash injection or investment. And so those are basically the paths that you would be able to follow. Family, extraordinary ability, employment sponsorship, or investment would be the typical paths. The last one I'll mention briefly here is that if someone has come from a country where there are particular challenges or concerns about persecution because of political opinion or religious beliefs or sexual orientation or something like that, then there is an asylum path as well that would allow someone who's here on an F1 student visa to seek protection from the U.S. government so that they don't have to return to a country where they would have those risks of being harmed or persecuted because of one of those protected grounds. So those would be the paths that I could think of.
Right. Wow. So for those of you listening or watching, we just did a video on the K-1 fiance visa, so I'd like to ask for that option. So marrying a U.S. citizen or a green card holder, so how would someone adjust their status through that option?
That's probably the most straightforward one, but obviously it involves the will and desires of another person, right? So in other words, the barrier to that avenue would be finding someone that you can get along with and that wants to be married. But if you have that opportunity, then basically, even while you're still a student, or perhaps at some point in the past, you stop being a student and are even here in the country without legal status, if you were to marry a resident or a citizen of the United States, then you file an application for permanent residence from here. And basically it's, for spouses of citizens in particular, it's a one-step process where the citizen files a petition, does a financial sponsorship as well. The F1 student would file a green card application. That'd be processed by U.S. Immigration, the USCIS. And then it leads to work authorization through that application process, travel authorization as well, so they can travel out of the country without the need for a visa.
Wow.
Eventually an interview with the immigration authorities where they're going to test basically background, financial fitness of the sponsor, because there is a financial sponsorship component there, and then the marriage to see whether or not it's actually a legitimate marriage.
Right.
And that's the biggest thing there, is as long as the intention is to be together in a relationship and to make a life together, and not just to get a green card or a business transaction or something like that, then chances are it's going to work out just fine in the end. It's a relatively short process. Typically here at this time in Dallas and Houston, we're seeing about a 15-month turnaround from submission to completion.
Okay.
So it's not terrible, and the work and travel permits come along the way so that you've got that flexibility to work anywhere that you'd like to, including for yourself or have your own company, and then traveling out of the country without the need for a visa. So there's huge benefits there. And when you're married to an American citizen, the other benefit is once you become a permanent resident, it's only 3 years till you're eligible to file for U.S. citizenship.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's a path to actual citizenship that you want to plan for, from the beginning when you get into the relationship.
Wow. So there's probably a couple things to be careful of with that option, right?
Yeah, the biggest one is just the relationship has to be legitimate, right? I mean, there's historically, there's even movies about this. A movie called Green Card from back in the day, for example, that's pretty funny. But basically, if you're trying to scam the government and use this as a path to, to permanent residence by fraud, you want to stay away from that. I mean, the government, they do this for their career, for their living as an agency, and all the employees there are very committed to protecting the U.S. country, right? Protecting the whole country, and so they're very vigilant about watching out for fraud and things like that. So as long as the relationship is legitimate, that's the most important thing. Some other things to look out for are the financial sponsorship part that I mentioned. If someone is sponsoring for permanent residence through a marriage relationship, as I mentioned earlier, they have a financial sponsorship obligation. And so if they're not working, or if they're disabled in some way, or if they don't have sufficient assets or income to qualify as a sponsor, then you could run into some trouble, because immigration doesn't want to give someone a green card who's then going to become dependent on the welfare system, right? And they're very concerned about that and protective of that system. And so as long as they've got sufficient income or assets, we're okay there. It's just a math question. But if they don't, then that could be a challenge that needs to be addressed, perhaps with a co-sponsor of some kind, someone that steps in to help support the application who's not the actual sponsor for the green card. Or we can sometimes, in some situations, use the income or assets of the person being sponsored. For example, if they have work authorization through their student status, which sometimes you can get, and they have an income themselves, and it's a marriage relationship to a U.S. citizen, we can use the income of the person being sponsored to actually qualify for the financial sponsorship piece.
Oh, wow.
So those are the two, marriage fraud and the financial sponsorship are the big ones, and then the last one would just be background. There is a very extensive background check that's conducted on each applicant for permanent residence. And that background check is basically going to cover things like criminal history, immigration history, and that's anywhere in the world. They're checking with Interpol and other agencies internationally just to make sure this is not a person that's been involved in terrorist activity and criminal activity and those kinds of things. So those are the big three.
Gotcha. So what about our other options? There was a business option that students are, typically driven. So it's,
True.
Probably they want to start their own business or maybe join a business. So could you talk about that option?
Sure. It's a little more complex than the marriage option, but I'll do my best to unpack it in a way that people can process.
Thank you.
Yeah. I can geek out on this stuff sometimes.
I know
right?
you
This is
can.
my thing. So basically, there's a couple of different paths, and it all depends on the net worth of the individual that's being sponsored. As I said before, some people that are here as students are already established financially somewhere in the world, or they have a family that is very well off, and so they're able to afford the education here, which is very high quality, especially when you get to the college level, university level. And so if they've got access to enough cash, and if they have nationality from certain countries, there's a couple of different paths. So we'll start with moving from a student visa to what's called an E2 investor visa. There's a list of countries that the State Department keeps that the United States has a treaty of commerce, friendship, economic exchange, whatever they call it. Some notable examples are most of Western Europe, Japan and South Korea. Jordan has a treaty, Pakistan and Bangladesh. Notable exceptions are China and India, which do not have those treaties with us, which to me is a little bit surprising, but I think when you consider the population size of those countries, it could be somewhat challenging for us to absorb, that many people that would potentially qualify for it. But anyway, if your country of nationality is on the list, and if you've got, we say at least $100,000 US that you'd be willing to invest.
Oh, wow.
You buy a business here and could switch over from an F1 student visa to an E2 investor visa and run your own business. Now, by itself, that scenario allows you to pivot out of the F1 student and get into a situation where you can have your own business and run your own company here. But it doesn't have a built-in pathway to a green card. There's other ways to get there, and I'm sure we'll have an episode on that at some point. But just know that if you've got access to that kind of cash, then you may be able to pivot out of the F1 student visa and switch over to the E2 investor visa option and have your own company here and continue going to school if you wanted to do that, by the way. But if you had a higher net worth, if you had access to closer to $1 million in cash, which obviously not a lot of people do, but some people do, then you could go down what's called the EB-5 route. And EB-5 is basically, you make an investment into a company, and you have to show that that investment is going to grow the number of employees, a net new jobs of 10 full-time within a 2-year time period.
Wow.
Yeah, so if you've got the cash and you want to invest it in this way, then EB-5 is a good option. There's 2 different paths there as well. One is through what's called a regional center, which is kind of like an investment bank, I guess. They basically have some deals that are coming in that people can invest in, funds that they put together to raise money, capital to do usually real estate development projects or business expansion projects, something like that. And basically, you give them your cash. They sort of become a sponsor for the EB-5 green card, and then they are kind of holding all the responsibility for the job creation. And typically, these funds are going to range from anywhere from maybe $10 million to $50 million, something like that, as a fraction or a portion of the total, funding of this development project. Typically, you'll see this in revitalization projects in urban areas and things like that, where things have gone into disrepair and decay. They'll buy up a big area of land and build some big office building or high-end apartment complex or even a stadium, for example. So that's EB-5, but you got to have the cash. E2 is another way to pivot out of F1 temporarily, as long as you have some cash and an idea that you want to pursue investment-wise.
So if you're, kind of doing this pivot and you're going into an EB-2 or EB-3 or even a 5, do you have to prove to USCIS that your original intent was to be a student and not to get a green card, or how does that work?
That's a very good question. So, as I mentioned early on, we've got the different concepts of immigrant, which is the green card, and non-immigrant, which is a temporary purpose visa, right? Like a visitor visa, a student visa, an investor visa, those kinds of things are all temporary in nature.
Okay.
So to be able to qualify for those, you have to show the U.S. government that you have an intention to depart at the end of your stay.
Okay.
Whereas with an immigrant, it has to be the opposite. It has to be your intention that you are intending to permanently reside here.
Right.
And in fact, that becomes an issue for some people that like to travel a lot, because if they're gone too much from the country, the government can actually take away permanent residence and force them back into a visa, because they're obviously just a temporary visitor and they're using it as a permanent visa, which you can't do. So they really hold everyone to that standard of immigrant versus non-immigrant. What is your intention? Now, once you've arrived here, your intention will be, as a student, for example, that you're going to stay on a temporary basis and just go to school, complete your studies, let it play out, and then leave. That's what your intention is at that time. But the truth is, people are people and intentions change.
Right.
And the law recognizes that. And so it's okay if you're moving from the non-immigrant realm into the immigrant realm, that's okay to do that, as long as when you enter the country, your intention was to be here on a temporary basis. If your intention changes because of opportunities that presented themselves or whatever, totally fine.
Oh, okay. Nice. So is there another option for people to, kind of become a citizen on their own or invest in themselves?
Yeah, the other one that we should talk about is called the National Interest Waiver. And frankly, we probably should add this to the list of a category of option that we do an episode dedicated on, because I get so many questions about this, and there's several reasons why. But let me talk about the requirements, and then we'll get into what some of the questions that people ask, and I'll do my best to briefly respond to some of those common questions that I get.
Yeah.
So if someone's going to come to the U.S. to do work that has the potential to benefit the country as a whole, the typical kind of standard case example would be medical research, right? So if someone's here doing like genetics research or microbiological research on cancer or Alzheimer's or other disorders that are genetically based or whatever, the kind of medical research, even pharmaceutical research, people that are doing work and have a unique background and skill set that make them qualified to do that specific kind of research, we want those people here, right? And so the National Interest Waiver provides that opportunity, that pathway for them to do that. Generally, you have to have a master's degree or higher degree to be able to qualify. And you have to, again, show that the scope of the work that you're going to be doing has the potential to benefit the country as a whole. And that can be somewhat challenging outside of the medical researcher. Medical research is easy to show how that has the potential to benefit the whole country.
Definitely.
If they have some breakthrough in cancer, prevention and treatment, obviously it's going to have a huge impact, a huge benefit. Heart disease, Alzheimer's, those kinds of things, right? Medical research is kind of an easy way of looking at it. But there's other things, too, that qualify as being in the national interest. For example, some cases that I've been involved with in the past are, or worked for a firm that we had some of these kinds of opportunities to work on national interest waiver cases. The person that developed the idea behind HOV lanes for traffic control, that guy got a national interest waiver.
Wow.
You can see how, right? Because the work that he was doing had the potential to benefit the country on a broad scale.
Yeah.
Right? There was another guy, an agricultural scientist, that developed a agricultural method for cultivating rice that led to a super high yield. Well, you could see how that would, create a benefit for the country as a whole when you're talking about food production, right?
Definitely.
So it's not just medical research. It could be, logistics. It could be agriculture. It could be, in some cases, it could be perhaps, something on the academic side of things, where they're doing research on an academic basis, like at a university, has the potential to have an influence or an impact on the country as a whole. The national interest waiver is an option. One of the reasons that this becomes challenging for people to understand how they qualify is that there's really three parts to a national interest waiver. One is you have to show that the work that you're doing has that national scope potential that I've been mentioning. The second one is they have to show that there's something unique about their background that makes them qualified to do that work. In other words, something about their background they're bringing to that opportunity creates the potential for the benefit for the country.
Right.
That there's something about them that's a little bit unique, maybe two different degree paths, two different master's degrees that sort of work together, genetics and microbiology, for example.
Wow. So
that make them a little bit unique relative to their peers. And for us to realize that scope potential, they really need to be doing this work. And the last one is, and this is where people get really tripped up, you have to have the present opportunity to do that work. And people miss that requirement because when you read about national interest waiver online, for example, even at a government source like uscis.gov, a very good place to get information about this stuff, they say specifically that you don't need a job offer to apply for a national interest waiver. That is 100% true. You have to show that you presently can do that work. They don't want to give someone a green card as a national interest waiver for them to come here and own a company doing food service or something. I mean, they want to make sure that when they come here, they can start doing that nationally significant work right away. So a job offer would meet that requirement, even though the law says it's not required specifically. But what else would meet it then is the question I get. And the answer is it could be your own company that you set up to do consulting in what you do, and 4 or 5 contracts from companies that want to hire you to come in and do that work for them. Or perhaps it would be a contingent job offer, a job offer where an institution or a company says, we intend to put this person to work for us for human resources reasons, regulatory reasons. We can't offer a job specifically, but if you guys give him a green card, then we'll put him to work right away as soon as he gets the green card. We're just waiting for that to happen first before we can make a formal offer, right? So there's certain things that we can do to present a case to the government that this person will be able to do that work right away when they get that green card through the National Interest Waiver.
Right.
So those are the big three of kind of self-sponsored: EB-1A for extraordinary ability, EB-1B for outstanding professors and researchers, and the National Interest Waiver, which is a really, really good option for a lot of people to pursue when they have that unique skill set and background and the opportunity.
Right. So let's see, have we talked about all of our options, or is there anything that we're leaving out from an F1 student visa moving into that permanent resident status?
Yeah, so there's the next one that we can talk about is some people call it labor certification. That's the technical term.
Okay.
Some people call it PERM, which is an acronym that the Labor Department uses for that same process. Some people refer to it as EB2 or EB3.
Okay.
And EB stands for employment-based, level 2 or level 3. And so basically that's company sponsorship through employment. So let's say that a student is finishing up their education. They've had an internship with the company that's made them an offer. When a student graduates at each level of education, which would be either associates or bachelors for 1, master's for 2, and a doctorate level for 3,
Okay.
their student visa allows them to apply for what's called optional practical training, or OPT, which gives them a work authorization to go do work in their field of study. And for people that are in science, technology, engineering, or math majors, STEM majors, you actually get a 1-year OPT with a potential for a 2-year extension, so 3 years total.
Okay.
Non-STEM just get 1 year at each level. But once they have that work authorization and they get a job, then they're able to potentially negotiate with their employer to sponsor them for an EB2 or EB3 labor certification to be able to move from student visa status over to permanent residence through that employment sponsorship.
Gotcha.
And there's no real requirements. I mean, we've done jobs that had no experience or education required, and just had one of those approved recently, actually. Those are risky, but you can do it. It's ideal if a person has at least a year of full-time paid work experience doing something related to the job that's offered with a different employer, not the one that's sponsoring them. And then obviously the higher the education level, the more restrictive we can be with the requirements for the job to make it so that we maximize their chance for success.
Right.
There's basically 3 stages of processing. We start with getting a wage determination where the Labor Department mandates how much the company has to actually pay that person to do that job. Because the government doesn't want, foreign nationals to come in and compete with U.S. workers for jobs because they're willing to take less money for the immigration path and depress wages for U.S. workers. So they require the employer to pay a certain wage that they mandate to be able to move forward with the process. So they make that determination as the first step. Second step is actually recruitment. The employer that's sponsoring the person has a very strict, regulated process for advertising for that job as though it were available to the public. And it's kind of silly, but one of the things that the Labor Department requires is a newspaper ad. And we used to do, when I started out, we would do Wednesday afternoon newspapers because it was the cheapest, because nobody read the Wednesday afternoon newspaper. But these days, nobody reads the newspaper, and yet the Labor Department requires us to pay for Sunday newspaper ads, which are the most expensive,
Wow.
in the biggest paper in the local area. So you can't pick, one of these smaller community papers. You got to pick, the Dallas Morning News or the Houston Chronicle or Fort Worth Star Telegram. And you got to pay those ridiculous rates, sometimes
Am I allowed to
several
ask how
thousands.
much it is?
Yeah, it's
Oh.
like $2,000 plus for an ad that's like 3 or 4 lines.
No way.
It's how newspapers are still alive. Yeah, somebody did a really good job lobbying the Labor Department to keep that as a requirement. It makes
Yeah, they
no
did.
sense because nobody reads the paper. Well, we have to do postings in those same areas to show those that are working there, what this job is paying, and just to make sure that U.S. workers aren't being disadvantaged within the company context. So there's a very regimented approach that we have to do. It takes about 90 days to get it all done. The State Workforce Administration here in Texas, that's Texas Workforce Commission, also has to have a posting there. So it's very publicized, even in the newspaper, to make sure that everybody has the chance to see that there's a job available.
Yeah.
And then as people apply for the job, or maybe no one does, but as people apply for the job, then the employer has to review those applications for the job, see whether or not they're actually qualified for the job. And if they are qualified for the job, then they either have to offer them a position that's in addition to the one that we're doing, or we stop the case.
Oh, wow.
And so the way I view it is that we want to get the smartest, best, most talented, most capable people working in our economy, regardless, right? We just want the best that we can get.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's part of what we help our employer clients do with the EB2 or the EB3 process.
That's interesting. I never
Yeah.
thought about it like that.
And the last one I'll just mention briefly here, because we don't have a lot of control over it. There is a lottery. The government puts out basically 50,000 or so green cards that are available each year that are just given out for diversity purposes. So if you're from a country where there's a high volume of people applying for permanent residence or green cards already, then the country will be excluded from the list for that given year. But as long as you're from a country that doesn't have that heavy of a load coming into the country, then you can apply to be included in that lottery selection. And there's millions of people that apply every year.
Really?
There's no cost to apply. And basically it's 50,000 visas so that we can maintain a level of diversity in our immigrant population here in the U.S. So they 100,000 win, 50,000 come with their families, and there's some requirements around it as well, but it's free to apply, and so people that are here on F1 absolutely can jump into the diversity visa lottery.
Wow.
And see if they happen to get selected, and if they do, great.
I had no idea that there was a lottery going on.
Yeah, there is.
That's pretty cool.
Yep. And frankly, it's a real benefit to each of us that we've got this program in place from my perspective.
Definitely. You've got a great perspective, very positive outlook. Well, I just wanted to say thank you very much for coming on our show today. We've really enjoyed having you, and we always do. And I just want to say thank you for watching, everyone. We've had so much fun talking about F1 student visas and the pathways and the options that are available to everyone out there. So tune in next time. Yay!
This podcast has been prepared for general information purposes only and is not legal advice. This information is not intended to create, and receipt of it does not constitute an attorney-client relationship.